Surviving the Applewhites, Chapter 27. Edie looked up from the computer screen as one of the 5 butterflies currently residing in the schoolroom fluttered past her to land next to another on a slice of overripe cantaloupe. It sank its long tongue into the soft orange flesh. 2 others were drinking from a saucer of sugar syrup on Jake's desk. Since the incident with Destiny's hair, coloring of any kind had been banned from the butterflies' food supply. Destiny's ears had faded to a pale lavender. The butterfly project, and the time when it had been so important to her, seemed very far away. It had been 12 days since the show in the barn, now called Wits End Playhouse, had completely taken over their lives. She couldn't even remember what her curriculum notebook would have had her doing this week. She yawned. Tonight was the first dress rehearsal, and she'd been up since 5:30. It was raining, which would cause trouble if it kept up all day. The way that they had had to build the stage, actors who had to exit on one side and come back on stage from the other had to run around the outside of the barn. No one had thought that would be a problem because it hadn't rained more than about 50 drops in 2.5 months. This part of North Carolina was in the midst of the worst drought in living history. But Zebediah had said that one thing he'd learned for certain in 70 years of living was not to trust the weather. On one of his prop runs, he had bought 2 dozen umbrellas and stationed a dozen at each exit, so an actor could grab one on the way out, run around, and drop it off on his way in. The stage crew, the prop crew, and the dressers, most of whom had been recruited from Traybridge High School, also had to run around the barn from one side of the stage to the other, but they were not going to be allowed to use the umbrellas. They had no costumes to protect. Edie was writing a notice to explain the rain plan now. She ran over her to-do list for the day one more time and smiled. It was actually beginning to look as if this impossible idea would work. If it did, she would have had a whole lot to do with it, not just because it was her idea in the first place, but because from the moment her father agreed to do the show in the barn, she had focused everything she had on getting things organized and keeping them that way. She had found out from the adults what needed to be done to get both the barn and the show ready for opening night, and then made a series of charts and sign-up sheets and schedules. These had taken over the schoolroom where the maps and papers and the butterfly chart used to be. Now one wall was devoted to barn renovation, another was for actors with rehearsal schedules, costume fittings, and lists of each actor's personal props. A third was for tech crews. She had a master list in a notebook she kept with her, and she kept all the charts and schedules updated so anyone could check them any time. The fourth wall she had reserved for clippings and internet printouts from local newspapers. The story kept changing shape. At first it had been about her father and Mrs. Montrose. Then Jake got to be in the middle of it. One local weekly told how working on the show was turning a delinquent around. But the Traybridge paper, under the headline, "Can Traybridge Support 2 Theaters?" suggested that the theater being built at Wits End by northern newcomers was intended to put the Traybridge Little Theater out of business. It speculated on the possible connection between the burning of a school in Rhode Island and a fire of uncertain origin at the Little Theater. Jake said bad press didn't bother him, but Randolph had fumed about the unfairness of the second story, and the TV news reporter who picked it up. "We never even thought of making it a theater until they canceled us." Lucille, who was both heading the costume crew and taking ticket orders on the phone, said that right after the story appeared, there was a huge increase in the number of ticket orders. Publicity, as Jeremy had said, was publicity. Sybil added that not only were their news stories good advertising, they were free. The ads running in the very same papers were costing a lot of Petunia Grantham money. Whether it was the free publicity or the ads, tickets were selling better than anyone had expected. With only 3 days to go till the opening, they had two sold out houses and decent sized audiences for the other performances. Almost half of the opening night seats would go to the media and to people who had donated props or costumes or helped with the show, and at least a third of the others were going to families of the actors. It didn't bring in much money to have that many complimentary tickets, but it guaranteed a full house for the most important night of the run, the night the network people would be there. This was the day the television crew was arriving, and Jeremy had been such a wreck when he came into the kitchen for breakfast that Govindaswamy had told him he wasn't going to be allowed to eat till he'd spent at least half an hour meditating. Then Sybil had insisted that everyone take a little time from their other jobs to clean the house. I won't have the world think that the author of the Petunia Grantham Mysteries lives in a pigsty. Now the house was at least moderately presentable. The Applewhites wouldn't look like slobs as long as the camera stayed away from the closets. The barn was almost ready. They'd been rehearsing on the newly built stage for 3 days now. Zebediah was overseeing the last of the construction work, and Hal, with help from Cordelia, was painting the sets. A butterfly landed on Edie's hand, and she waved it gently away. They had no fear of humans at all, these butterflies. Outside she heard a car pull to a stop. After a moment Winston began barking. This must be the television people, she thought. Hurriedly she printed out the notice about the umbrellas and went to pin it up on the wall. As she did, she heard someone come into the schoolroom behind her. She turned her head to see who it was and was so startled that she stabbed the pushman into her finger. She yelped, "Ah!" That bad, huh? Jake was standing there in his usual black t-shirt and black pants. But that was all that was usual about him. Gone was the eyebrow ring, gone were all the earrings, and gone was the scarlet hair. He had a dark brown crew cut now, so short that his scalp showed through. Behind him, Winston stood making low growling sounds. "So what do you think?" Jake said. "Could I make it in the SS?"